Alice was a woman who, with her family, had just moved to a rural part of the country. And she really wanted to get to know the other ladies that were in the school. And so she joined the PTA. As soon as she got there, there was a bake sale coming up. She volunteered to bake a cake. But she forgot all about that baking the cake thing until the morning the cake was due. And she panicked. She so wanted to be accepted by the other ladies at the PTA, and so she ran to the pantry. She found a cake mix, and she just hurriedly threw everything together, put it in the oven, went to get ready for work. But when she came out to ice the cake, when she took it out of the oven, the whole center of the cake just flopped. And she was just, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? I can't show up without the cake. I can't be And so she had an idea. She got a roll of toilet paper and she mushed it down and she stuck it right in the middle of the cake and covered the toilet paper roll with cake and then iced the cake. And she decided to take the cake to the PTA for the bake sale. She called her adult daughter who lived in town and said, please be there at 9:30. And when you see my cake, buy it before anybody else does. She went off to work. Well, about 10 o'clock, she got a call from her adult daughter and said, Mom, I got there a little bit late. By the time I got there, somebody else bought your cake. And Alice was mortified because she thought, oh my gosh, from now on, this will be the joke that will never die. Everybody in the PTA will remember this every year, and every time we do a bake sale or a fundraiser, I'm just going to be mortified. Well, she went to sleep tried to go to sleep that night, and was restless all night. She said, how could I have been such an idiot? Well, the next day, she had been invited to a baby shower at the mayor's wife's house. It was kind of an upper crust kind of deal, and she was excited to be there. And they had their luncheon, and then it was time for dessert, and the mayor's wife brought out the desserts for the dessert table, and to her horror, her cake was at the center of the dessert table. And she died 1,000 deaths once again. And one of the ladies came over to the dessert table, and in front of everybody said, oh, this is such a beautiful cake. Who made it? And she was thinking, am I going to say something? But before she could, the mayor's wife said, I did. It doesn't pay to play fast with truth. Fast and loose with truth. Which reminds me, my wife's a teacher, and after Easter and spring break, the elementary school, they come back, they do show and tell. And one particular kid was so excited, he wanted to tell, where did you go for spring break? And this one kid, teacher, call on me. And so he did. Where did you go? He said, we went to see my grandparents at Minneapolis, Minnesota. And the teacher said, well, that's good, Jeffrey. Can you spell Minneapolis, Minnesota? And he thought for a minute and he said, well, actually, teacher, we went to Ohio. We do play fast and loose with the truth sometimes. John 1:17, it's spoken of Jesus. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And we are beginning a series today with grace and truth as the theme for this. And we are going to tackle in a number of weeks a very complex issue, and that's the element of truth. As you know, we live in a very divided country. And there are, divisions about Republicans and Democrats and pro-life and abortion and vaccines and masks and mandates, capitalism and socialism and communism. What is marriage? What is gender? There are a lot of things that if you mention almost any one of these things at work, you are going to be showered with opinions. And therein is the problem. Opinions. Is there truth about marriage? Is there truth about gender? Is there truth about finances and how those things work? Well, we're going to tackle those things after we look at what is truth. Again, in our particular culture, there is a wide pendulum of three things that we're going to look at regarding truth. One of the verses I like in the Old Testament is 1 Chronicles 12:32. One of the tribes of Israel was Issachar, and it was said at a very crucial time in Israel's history, From Issachar, men who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. It is my hope that in this series that we become a people who understand the times and can come to some conclusions about that. Now, in talking about truth, one of the things that there are a couple things that have to be said even before we talk about truth, and that is presuppositions. From the time all of us, every one of us were little kids, we began to take in all kinds of information about life. And this just happened hardly without even knowing it. In our mind, an amazing thing that it is, would sort of filter and put the different pieces we were that we were gathering in about God and about life and about human nature and relationships and meaning and purpose. And by the time we sort of hit high school, we already have kind of a, this is how the world is in our heads. It's not that we've really ever studied any of these things or done any research, but it's just sort of is how we are and how we look at the world. These are the glasses we wear, presuppositions. What presuppositions tell us when we think about truth is there is not one person who is bias-free. None of us are bias-free when we think about truth. We all come to the table here. We want to believe we're open-minded, but we all come to the table with an agenda already of how we think the world is. Let me give you 3 examples. I'm going to call them 3 pendulums, which is the title of our message. But these are all presuppositions. And in our culture, these presuppositions make up part of why we are such a divided country. So pendulum number 1, I'm going to call, do we live in a God-centered universe or a human-centered universe? Now, probably before I even finish this question, you already knew where you landed on this pendulum. That's a presupposition. A God-centered universe or a human-centered universe. Number 2 is truth. Is truth a God-centered thing or is it a human-centered thing? Is there absolute truth or is there relative truth? Is truth eternal? Is it for all times and all places, for all people? Or is it up for grabs over here? Is truth just personal? Is it just preference? Or is truth just your truth, my truth, or how you feel about things? Again, you probably already know where you land. That's a presupposition. The third pendulum is the pendulum of, if you're familiar with the term grace, which is not what you do before a meal, but this is the pendulum of acceptance. So over on here, how do we find our sense of acceptance or our sense of peace about ourselves? Over here on this side, what the New Testament tells us is what we sang about this morning, the wonder of grace. That because of the cross and because of what Jesus did for us, we can become accepted. God can accept us, not because we're so good, but the opposite reason, because we will fail. We will always fail in this life and fail to live up to even our own standards, let alone God's standards. This is the wonder of grace. To be seen for who I am and to still be wanted by him. The pendulum over here in our culture is human acceptance. And human acceptance sort of has 2 things of which you're aware. One is finding, how can I accept myself? And here you look in the mirror and we usually have our bike pump and we're pumping up ourselves to try to put up our self-esteem and how we look at ourselves, our self-worth. Or the acceptance of people that we agree with. Now the question is, for all 3 of these pendulums, what works? What works for people? What works better than others? There's another element that we have to take into account besides presuppositions, and that's what I think of as cultural truth. Cultural truth is that which just sort of everybody kind of gravitates toward. It's not that we really say these things, but it's just sort of, you can think of it as what you need to say in order to get along with, in general, with people and not to make a mess of your life. And the way that cultural truth happens is through cultural institutions. And so things like government and politicians play into this. Hollywood, movies, TV plays into this. Books plays into this. The arts, music plays into this. The universities and schools. Now even business plays into sort of establishing a cultural truth. Now, whether it's actually true or not is to be debated. But that's another element, again, that tells us this is sort of the world we live in. And the thing to know about cultural truth is that it has a very strong social hook to it. A very strong social hook to it. When you're a teenager, when I was a teenager, one of the things my mother asked me often was, well, Seth, if all of your friends were going to jump off the Eiffel or the Empire State Building, would you jump off too? Now, what she was calling me on was this social hook of going along in order to get along. In other words, truth is not just a matter of our rationality, but it has a strong social component to it. In John chapter 5, Jesus was talking to the Jewish religious leaders, and he said, I do not accept glory from human beings, but I know you. I know that you do not have the love of God in your hearts. I have come in my Father's name, and you do not accept me. How can you believe who accept glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God? Here, he's talking about this social aspect to how we know things. And that we are not an unbiased people, but we are heavily affected by the people around us socially. We live in a world with both peer pressure and now fear pressure. We call this cancel culture. And if you happen to say the wrong thing that goes against the cultural truth at work, you may lose your finances, your job, your career, or your reputation. Well, on the inside of your handout, what is the truth? Well, before we look at this episode with Jesus, if you have not studied history or philosophy, and I am constrained by time, so this is going to sound very simplistic to you, but I'm trying to give you, how did we get for thousands of years that there was absolute truth, over here in our culture, well, truth is relative, personal, and just happens to be preference or feelings? Well, about 400 years ago, the Enlightenment hit Western civilization, and the philosophers then decided to try to answer the great philosophical questions. Who are we? How did we get here? Is there an afterlife? Is there a God? What's the purpose and meaning of life? They began to answer those questions without a God answer. They tried to say, what can we do? What can we say about how can we explain life as we know it without God? You can think of this very simply as the death of God beginning, although that was not said at that time, but that was a huge shift in Western civilization. Fast forward a couple years to Darwin and Darwin's evolution of the species. And what philosophers took from that book was, are we evolving as a human race physiologically? But what the philosophers said, are we evolving as a race ethically, morally, personally? And that began about the mid-19th century. And when you throw in the advent of education and the Industrial Revolution, by the time we finished the 19th century, coming into 1900, philosophy looked at the golden age of humanity that was about to embark in the 20th century. It was one of the high points of human hope. The pendulums had all swung in this direction. And everything looked bright until 1914, when World War I broke out. And for the first time, a war that encompassed more than just a particular area. And the thing that was devastating to philosophers was the place where this war initiated, which was Germany, had the highest educational people and philosophers the world had ever known. And they could not explain, how is it that a country so educated and so progressive in terms of human nature, how could this happen? And then France and England got involved in the war, and we got involved in the war, and philosophers were just shaking their heads like, what happened to the golden age? War ended in 1918. The Depression came in 1929, not just in our country, but around the world, lasting about 10 years. And then when World War II hit, it shook philosophy to the ground. Because again, Germany, the height of philosophical thought, education was at the center of this. And the World War II came and evolved all around the globe. In that vacuum, philosophical vacuum, came three philosophical things. Materialism, not meaning greed, but that all that really matters and is what is seen, materialism. And then modernism and postmodernism, and the result of these three things we find ourselves in basically is there is no God. We are here by ourselves. There's no metric for right and wrong, no metric for good or evil. We just have to make up our meaning as best we can. And that's where we are in our culture. We keep sliding in this direction over the last 20 years or so. Regarding truth, Jesus was arrested and he was taken to Pontius Pilate, the governor in Jerusalem, the Roman governor. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. Now my kingdom is from another place." Now, Pilate completely missed what he was trying to say. "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." And again, Pilate completely missed what he was saying. But this famous question that he asked has been asked all down through human history. What is truth? In our current culture, in Western civilization, particularly in America, why is crime up? Why is opioid abuse up? Why do we have this epidemic of suicide? Now, there are lots of reasons for these, but at the heart, our culture has taken out any framework for or basis for meaning and purpose in life, and you throw 13, 14, 15-year-olds into a very difficult world without any kind of framework, and is it any shock that we are having difficulties in these three areas? Truth matters. Truth matters for us as human beings. In the book of Judges, an Old Testament book, there's a long descent of human nature through hundreds of years recorded in Judges. And one of the statements that explains this downward descent of humanity is in your handout, Judges 17:6. "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." Now, if you are a postmodernist, you look at that statement, everybody did what was right in his own eyes, and you think, that's right. That's what you have to do. That's the way to live your life. But if you understand what the Bible says about human nature, you look at this thing and go, that is a bad idea. Trying to live on this side of those pendulums is not a good idea. Well, we come to an episode which probably, even if you've never read the Bible, you know this episode. And if you've never memorized a verse, I'll bet you have memorized one of the verses in this episode, and you may have even quoted this verse to a friend. Well, it comes from John chapter 8. We'll start with verse 2. "At dawn, Jesus appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, 'Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?' They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accepting him." Now, back in that day, adultery was a really bad thing. In our culture today, I talk to a lot of people, and one of the things that's so fascinating to me is that there are a lot of people who commit adultery that really are able to justify this to themselves. And even the one that they are committing adultery, the other party, they are able to justify this adultery of the one. Now that may be where our culture is moving, but I've also talked to a lot of people who have experienced adultery on the bad end of this. And I can tell you that adultery matters. There is nothing like this kind of betrayal and rejection and replacement. It is horrendous. And I talk to a lot of kids, and a lot of kids who grew up in a broken home, who become adults, and this is the gift that keeps on giving. And yet, so here, what does he say? Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, and here's your verse. Let any of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. Again, if you've never read the Bible, never memorized the verse, I know you know that verse. All at this, those who heard began to go away one at a time. So think about 50 men who are there. Jesus and this woman out in public at the temple courts, and they slowly are all leaving in this quiet. Jesus straightened up. At first, those who heard began to go away one at a time. The older ones first. Only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Now it's just the two of them. Jesus straightens up and asks her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" And she says, "No one, sir." "Neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Now go and leave your life of sin." Now, all three pendulums are illustrated in this story. Pendulum number 2 is the pendulum of truth. Adultery, clearly to Jesus, was wrong, and it was devastating. It is a bad idea. And at the end of the story, he tells her, leave your life of sin. Leave that behind. Pendulum number 2. Now, pendulum number 3, how is it that we find acceptance, is also in this story. So for him, what he says here is, neither do I condemn you. Go and leave your life of sin. One of the images I love about this particular story is after the 50 guys leave and the two of them are standing there. She knows what she did. She knows that he knows what she did. But he is standing with her. He is standing with her publicly in the temple courts. Now, not because he's standing with her in her sin, but he is standing with her as a woman who knows that she has failed, and yet she is experiencing the wonder of what we call grace. Acceptance in spite of what I've done. And there is no greater hunger in the human heart than this. It's what we try to find over here, looking in the mirror and trying to find self-acceptance. But over here, self-acceptance always is determined by how you're doing, your success or failure rate. On this end of the pendulum, that has nothing to do with it. And then the first pendulum, which is embedded in this story, do we live in more of a God-centered universe or a human-centered universe? And which of these is really truer to life? And here, clearly, the God-centered one. Well, we are just talking about the resurrection. And I just want to say a few things briefly about the resurrection. There were about 7 times where Jesus claimed to his disciples he was going to be arrested, flogged, whipped, crucified, or killed. He would rise from the dead after 3 days. Now, those first 3 truth claims are possible that you could try to happen. You could get yourself arrested. You could do it in such a way that you're going to get flogged and maybe get the death sentence. But the last 2 truth claims, nobody can guarantee. Resurrected from the dead, and the when. 3 days afterwards. Those are 2 difficult truth claims to come through on. So on the back of your handout, we'll read some excerpts from the resurrection day from Mark 16. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. Very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" And looking up, they saw the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. He said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now, one of the things that I hear out in secular culture is, well, the disciples and the people around Jesus, they were just naive. And they wanted this to be true, wish fulfillment kind of thing. They were gullible. There is not one story of Jesus' resurrection where he appears to somebody where somebody is gullible. In fact, every one of these, we'll read some of them here, it's the opposite. They were stunned. Almost like, prove it. I don't get this. Verse 9, when he arose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him as they mourned and wept. But when they heard he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. So that next round of people that they told, no, that can't be true. After these things, he appeared in another form to 2 of them, these 2 men walking to the town of Emmaus. As they were walking into the country, they went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them. Afterward, he appeared to the 11 disciples, as they were reclining at table, and he rebuked them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen. What the resurrection does, in one sense, and there's really a lot of senses here, but the truth claims of Jesus are verified through the resurrection. I am no longer left to opinions, to have to figure out life. There really is a God answer to this equation of the great philosophical questions. We are not left to ourselves to figure this out. And then as we sang, and as you heard in Karen's testimony, and in the skit guys, it's not just we're talking theology here. We're talking about us as people. We were made to experience something from God that we cannot experience on our own or from anyone. The skit guy talked about filling our emptiness. Pendulum 2, or Pendulum 3, is the acceptance aspect. Being able to really be at peace with who I am in spite of my failures. And be at peace and have a sense of joy even when life is hard. These are some of the things that the resurrection asserts for us when we come to Jesus Christ. Let's pray together. Father, I pray that for all of us here, that as we wrestle with the great questions of life, that you would help us to see where we already come with a biased mind. And would you help us to be open to you and not have hard hearts, to really listen to what you have to say about these things. These things matter. And they don't just matter philosophically or rationally, but they matter personally. And they matter in our marriage. And they matter with our kids and with our friends. We thank you for Jesus Christ and what he accomplished on the cross and the resurrection. In Jesus' name, amen.